There we are. I can see attendees dripping in now, Sarah, just to
yeah,
if you can as well. Yep. I'll give them a few seconds just to hop through. Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We'll just be getting started in a few moments. We're just giving some time for the software to filter everybody into the room. So we'll be starting in about 30 seconds. Thank you. Okay, very good. I think we might get started. So we've got a few attendees in the room. We've got a few others listening in on Facebook and on other platforms, I understand, which is the wonders of modern technology that you can do this across multiple streams. Always very impressed by that. So thank you again for the tech support, Adam. Welcome everybody to tonight's fascinating discussion with Dr. Sarah Kyambi, who's an independent policy expert on both UK and I would say Scottish immigration and integration policy. Very high level expertise, advising a range of organisations from government, NGOs, even some corporates I understand, which is always fascinating. And is also director of Migration Policy Scotland, which I also understand she founded. And that organisation have been coming out with some very interesting work recently on the issues that we're about to be covering over the course of the evening. So welcome, Sarah. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Before we get into the, no, of course. Before we get into the detail of the conversation, I might do a few bits of ground keeping if that's okay. The first is to warn everybody that this is being recorded, so we can't say Chatham House rules, I'm afraid. We may have our comments held against us in the future, so to speak. So yes, that being warned. The other thing to say is that if you would like to raise a question, you may have been a participant in a number of Zoom conversations, etc. before during lockdown. I suspect you have been. We're not following perhaps the normal way of doing things in terms of question and answer. Instead of using the chat function, if you could go down to the bottom of your screen and use the Q&A function, which pops up as you hover over the bottom of the Zoom screen, that's how we'll be taking questions. And what we'll do is I'll be asking Sarah a few questions to get ourselves going. But it may be that, or indeed, I'm sure it will be, that the participants today will think of more interesting questions than I can. And so we'll perhaps mold them into the discussion as we go. So as I say, the topic of today's discussion is a broad one, covering all ambits of immigration and Scottish policy on immigration, so to speak. I come at this from the very narrow angle of a lawyer, and not even an immigration lawyer I've got to apologise for, but an employment lawyer. So I only tangentially touch on these issues in my day-to-day practice. And I come at it from a very narrow perspective that understands that immigration is not a devolved issue under the Scotland Act. And so why would the Scottish Government have anything to say about it? And I think that viewpoint, although definitely the basic view of a number of people, both within the Scottish Labour Party and elsewhere on the left, that view is being questioned, I think it's safe to say. And it may be into some of that today, but I think the more interesting topic is to look at the policy divergence rather than the legal divergence on both sides of the border. So if I could welcome Sarah now to the discussion and ask her perhaps to give us a little bit about herself and her expertise and some of the work that she's been doing, particularly over the last few years on the very incredibly wide topic that we have to discuss today.
Okay, and I hope I'm going to be able to answer what might be a very wide-ranging set of questions. But I have a fairly broad background. I did my PhD in a law department, so technically I'm by discipline a lawyer. But then I left academia and did some legal casework representing immigration cases before coming to policy work. And I've worked for a number of think tanks in London, in Brussels, and in Edinburgh. And that included working at the migration team at IPPR. And as you said, I'm a consultant. I provide expertise to a wide range of people. And that expertise basically combines an academic legal background with social research techniques in a way that focuses on addressing real world issues. But I've been based in Scotland since 2006, and I found increasingly that there's a degree of policy work to be done on migration that looks at Scotland. So as far back as 2009, I wrote a paper on the scope for regional differentiation within the UK immigration system. But I've always thought that while there's quite a lot of infrastructure in Scotland around asylum, there isn't actually very much on migration issues more generally. And that always struck me as a curious gap, and that gap became both larger and more urgent after the Brexit vote. So that I found increasingly, and there was a demand for that kind of work and a demand for thinking about how immigration policy would go forward and how that would affect Scotland post-Brexit. So last year I spent some time scoping out the need for migration policy work that focused on Scotland, discovered that there was a great deal of need. Some of the issues that are pertinent in Scotland don't tend to get picked up at a UK-wide level. So they sort of bubble under for a while and there's no real outlet. And as you've said, the sort of de facto thing that happens there is then that the Scottish government tries to represent those issues because there is no other voice. And that's both been positive, but also has drawbacks in my view. And I really think there needs to be a third sector voice on these issues in Scotland, informed by Scotland. And I'm trying to set that up. And I think as we are actually set up, I'm hoping we will be funded and running by the end of this year.
Great, and thank you for that summary. I now had to confess that and it may be pertinent given that I'm hosting this session, that I as a young researcher previously working in the Scottish Parliament remember reading a couple of your papers from way back when, okay. And try to influence from the inside Labour Party policy on the matter in terms of devolution of immigration matters. So I probably share the sympathies that you have in realising that there is space for that differentiation within Scotland, and that Scotland could perhaps not just in the asylum sphere but in other areas of immigration seek out a different path. So as you mentioned, you come at this from the legal background, and I mentioned already that under the Scotland Act, immigration is a reserved matter, and so it resides in Westminster. That's obviously the legal fundamentals. But I understand in recent work that you've been doing, you've been exploring some of the policy divergence that could exist, and indeed slightly to a certain extent does exist, between approaches between the Scottish and UK governments. So would you mind giving us a few examples of how migration and also, quite importantly, integration are currently handled either side of the border, if you
Sure. So I mean, you're absolutely right. Immigration is a reserved matter under the Scotland Act. But the thing is, immigration is about people, and so you've got lots of people, so there's lots of policy areas that both affect migrants or are affected by migration, and those policy areas are devolved, whether they're housing, employment, and economic policy, and so on. And so what you've seen over time has been divergence in the approaches to that. So an example of that would be, for instance, on asylum, that integration funding is available to asylum seekers in Scotland and has been for a long time, which is simply not available to asylum seekers in England until they attain refugee status. Similarly, the Scottish Government has not implemented legally some aspects of the hostile environment where those touch on devolved policy areas. So for instance, landlord checks are not legally required in Scotland. They do actually happen because estate agents have adopted them, or people believe that they're required and so that it happens, but actually that's not been legislated for in Scotland. So you see these small examples of divergence. On integration, I mean, in Scotland, there isn't really integration policy for migrants as such. There is some specifically for refugees under the New Scots policy, but not for migrants in general, but certainly that's kind of tackled under a variety of other headings, reception policies, equalities policies, and so on. I would say, just to summarize that, is that the approach in Scotland is still a lot more multicultural, I would say. then the kind of shift we've seen away from multiculturalism to whether you call it community cohesion, there's been other names for that in England, that goes right back to even under the Blair government, but it has accelerated. So under cohesion related approaches, often there's an underpinning concern to bring communities together. There's often quite restrictive language or a language about the burdens and the responsibilities that migrants must bear, particularly around English language learning, which is a bit unfortunate because I think most migrants are desperate to learn English. It's just the opportunities to do so can be very scarce. Whereas in Scotland, we still have the flavor of it is still much more multiculturalism, with a celebration of diversity, with an acknowledgement that we need to provide the infrastructure to allow people to integrate. So the language of that approach is different. And again, in the politics, I think is where you see, and the rhetoric is where you see the most distinct difference. There's a more positive political debate. There's often cross-party consensus on a broadly positive approach to migration. And as you said recently, that there, we've seen in response to the UK government's proposals on immigration, in the future immigration post-Brexit, that the Scottish government has brought out its own proposals. And you can see here that what the two governments are trying to, what they're looking for from migration is very different. So what the Scottish government is concerned about is how a very selective approach to migration might lead to will lead to shortages in Scotland, where wage levels are lower. And the fact that Scotland is actually very much in the business of trying to attract migrants and trying to retain them. And I think this actually goes beyond the party political. We've seen policies, migration policies related to the demographic needs of Scotland before the SNP administration, under the Fresh Talent regime, which was, I think, back in 2004, which allowed post-study, kind of a special post-study visa for students in Scotland. So this is something which is really addresses one of what I think is a key driver behind that difference, which is the difference in the demographics between Scotland and England.
And you talked about Fresh Talent. I think that's one of the key examples everybody always plucks out when they think of how we might want to deviate. We, I say, as Scotland, could work with the Home Office to account for certain variations within existing UK immigration structures. And you also mentioned in the last question more of a celebration of multiculturalism within Scotland and perhaps the public purse funding some of that celebration as well. So I think, for example, of the One Scotland Many Cultures campaign, which existed again, I think, in the mid to late noughties. Are there any other kind of examples of particular policy proposals or even public spending priorities that demonstrate the differences of opinion? Obviously, we've got vans driving around London down south that demonstrate the focus down there. But are there other particular policies in Scotland that you would think of as examples of?
I think you've highlighted one of the key ones, which is the campaigns. There was One Scotland campaign, but there's also been one more recently, One Scotland Many Cultures. I tend to forget what the strap lines are.
Yes,
but the messaging is different, and there's clearly funding behind that. I thought one of the most effective things that I saw most post-Brexit in that vein was the letter from the First Minister to EEA nationals resident in Scotland saying, "You are welcome here. We do want you to stay." That went to every, I guess, traceable EEA national resident in Scotland at the time, I think within weeks of that vote. And it's been it's been a nice one because you've seen that filter through into the research where when people where there has been research into how EE nationals feel about Brexit and how they feel about whether they're welcome, that there is actually, that comes up as something that makes them feel Scotland is more welcoming. And that general rhetoric, which I suppose fits into very much the SNP's casting of itself as a civic rather than an ethnic nationalism, that's sort of outward welcoming, outward facing welcoming, so that's there. I mean, I don't want to comment on the funding as such. As I said, a lot of integration programs are mainstream, so it's difficult to know what's
being spent where,
what's been spent on which populations exactly, and how you might compare that. And I think mainstreaming is probably, in most instances, the way in which integration policies should operate. So I can't really comment much further on that. I think the main driver here, that quite clearly, is the demographics.
Indeed. And turning straight onto that, I think we've received a question in the Q&A from Chris, which I'll come on to in a moment. I think an absolutely excellent question, just to prepare you for it. Okay. But perhaps getting us onto that broad topic, I wonder if you could expand a little, as you just hinted at the link between migration and the demographics that exist within Scotland. I wonder if you'd want to say a little bit to introduce your thinking on that, and the kind of the background of different pressures north of the border versus south that feed into some of the debates, with the discussion we've already had. And then I'll turn to Chris's question.
Okay. So on the demographics, so Scotland has a history as a country of emigration until fairly recently. So you see that flip around in the early 2000s, where it becomes a country of net in-migration. So basically, before that, more people were leaving Scotland than arriving in it. And after that, more people were starting to arrive. And just as that turn was achieved, there was a sort of concerns about the threat of population decline in Scotland and what that might mean for sustainability, particularly should 5 million was sort of this weird marker that was set at that point as something that if the population fell below 5 million, that somehow certain areas might not be viable. It's never as cut and dried as that. But so there was a debate around that. And certainly ever since then, it's overseas migration that's been a key component of population growth in Scotland. And that migration both helps, it stops population decline, and it helps to offset population aging. Now I say offset because it's actually quite a complicated relationship. Migrants also age. Migrants' birth rates tend to come into line with the birth rates of where they arrive. So it's not a magic bullet, and it's also not an easy solution, because the factors that make people leave certain places would also make migrants leave those places. So if you don't have the opportunities, if you don't have the things that make people want to live somewhere, kind of, just add migrants isn't the solution. But on the other hand, migrants does give you another pool of people that you might try to fit into what is quite a tricky situation, and that might work quite well. And we've seen that in other countries as something to be done. So it's quite a complicated thing, but it addresses a very, very challenging question, which is about dependency ratios. Aging populations have higher dependency ratios, which means that your working age population is having to support a larger and larger dependent population, either at the top end where they're aging out, or at the bottom end, which might be a bit better because at least they'll age into the workforce at some point. And that's a very clear difference from what we're seeing in England, which still has England also has an aging population, but certainly it's not at the same rate and stage as where we're at in Scotland. And a very restrictive approach to migration basically deprives Scotland of a key way of trying to address that very complicated, very challenging issue. So we know, for instance, in the current proposals, so the ones that were in the white paper last year, once you work that through, the reductions in migration that are presumed to follow from that in England, you still have a growing working age population, whereas in Scotland, as a result of those proposals, you would have a shrinking working age population. Now, a shrinking working age population is a very bad thing.
So sorry, I thought you were going to expand on that, but yes, I think it is.
Why this is such a hot issue.
Indeed.
So,
and I suppose
I guess that's where that comes from. And let me know what this question is that I'm now hotly anticipating.
Indeed. Well, I think it's Chris Murray in the comments has highlighted, and I think I perhaps just read it verbatim, and you can. There's a number of different strands to it. For the whole of devolution, immigration of EU migrants wasn't reserved to Westminster, but in fact Brussels, and people arrived in the UK, throughout the UK, through free movement. But in Scotland, we don't have a track record of A, attracting enough EU citizens to address our population decline, or B, integrating EU citizens any more socially cohesively or economically than the rest of the UK. Doesn't that show that the problems aren't with the immigration powers, but in fact Scotland's capacity to attract, integrate and retain migrants? Now, it may be that you disagree with some of the premises that that question is based on, feel free to, or it may be that you agree. I wonder if there's a number of different strands to that
on my
you could try and tackle.
Trying to unpack the different elements, and I'm not sure that I can do it all justice.
Perhaps we could take the first element, which is there evidence of Scotland failing to attract enough EU citizens to address the population decline?
So what I'll do is so immigration. It's an odd thing to call immigration of EU migrants as reserved to Brussels. It wasn't reserved to Brussels. It was governed by free movement, which means that we had an agreement with the rest of the EEA member states, plus places like Switzerland, that people can move freely within that space, and that movement is supported by equivalences in social security and rights and so on. And out of that free movement, we did see an awful lot of people come to Scotland and settle in Scotland, because they had the freedom to do so. So the difference will be that under the new system, they will not have the freedom to do so. They will need to go through a UK immigration system that imposes certain types of restrictions, like a salary threshold, a skills threshold, and so on. Rather than what was basically a system where people could arrive and look for work, and once they found it, they could change their job, they could make various next on decisions about what they might do with that. And in fact, an awful lot of that was very successful, and EEA nationals are now the largest migrant group in Scotland. What is it? Just over 10 years after accession.
Yes.
Accession. So yes, actually, that migration did address the population decline. Before accession, population was going down, and we were concerned about that net migration was going down. Certainly after accession, when the migration of EEA nationals took a big increase after those countries joined, and during the initial years of that, the UK was one of only 3 countries in which people from those countries could arrive. So yes. The rest of the a lot of the other EU countries kept their labour markets closed for that. So in a way, we saw more than we expected, because at that time we had been expecting all of the labour markets to open, but actually a lot of other countries took a more phased approach. So we saw more than expected, but for the large part, I think that was beneficial, because actually all of those people were working, or most of those people were working, and that was the point of it. So that first, yes, we did actually attract enough migrants within that system to address population decline. The problem is that under the new system, which is coming in just over 3 months, it's highly likely that we won't. The second one, about integrating EU citizens any more socially cohesively or economically than the rest of the UK. I think that's a really difficult one to call. How would you score, structure, settle that? I think like any migration from EEA nationals has had its challenges. But I think for the most part, it's been mainly beneficial. We certainly have seen the role that EEA nationals have played in sustaining agriculture and hospitality in Scotland, sustaining some of the smaller areas. So I think I would disagree with that. I haven't seen any research where you've tried to directly compare that in any way between Scotland and elsewhere. So it's not, I do think that there are problems with immigration powers if this becomes more restrictive. And I think we need to understand that what is coming will be significantly more restrictive than what we've had as long as we've known it. So the end of free movement, after free movement, around about, I think estimates I've seen is around about 70% of people who came under free movement will not qualify to enter the UK under the new system. So that is a big change. I can talk you through a little bit what the new system is going to look like or where I think that might go, but that is a big change. And under that, we expect, you know, net migration to Scotland to fall at the moment, unless sort of ameliorations are made within that system.
Indeed, and one of the this is again me coming at it with a bit of a blunderbuss approach, again not being an immigration lawyer, and again apologies for that. But my very rudimentary understanding is that there's going to be some points-based system. We're trying to copy Australia, and that little allowance will be given within that points-based system for regional, or indeed no allowance will be given within that points-based system for regional demands, regional or national, I should say. And so as a result, you will have, given that perhaps salary level or particular levels of areas of expertise will be given priority within, by being given more points than other roles, quite naturally within that system, the southeast of England will be able to demonstrate more of it. So, I mean, the migrants that it would traditionally attract would go there.
Basically,
is that right?
If you use salary as a threshold, it's easier to attract a migrant to an area where salaries are higher than it is to where they're lower. It's easier to have leave. And so actually the oddest thing about this new system is that it actually funnels migrants exactly where the kind of population density argument applies, which would be London and the southeast, because that's where wages are highest. Whereas areas where wages are lower will struggle to meet the threshold, which is currently set at 25,600.
Indeed.
And you need to think about the regional impact of that also. So for instance, in Scotland, it's very easy to see that in some rural areas, there are absolutely no jobs that meet that threshold, whereas in cities, there will be jobs. But you also need to think about it in relation to sectors. So for instance, the care sector, 90% of roles in the Scottish care sector don't meet the tier 2 threshold. Now, it seems to me that we are going to keep needing people to work in the care sector in Scotland. Yes. I think that is entirely predictable. So that's an issue. And as you said, you know, the problem about regional variation within that. So the government, the proposals state that they are proposals that are intended to work for the whole of the UK. But there has not been much positive response to the Scottish government's requests for a more regionalised system, maybe a Scottish visa where you could alter some, you know, maybe where you could prioritise some of the things that Scotland is trying to do for migration, which is to get migrants maybe into difficult to populate areas, maybe into difficult to sustain sectors, maybe selecting them with a very clear focus on their life cycle, where you're very much targeting people who are going to stay, and maybe
the Australian approach,
and help, you know, and that's a really difficult policy aim to try and put that through. But it is done in other countries, and it can be done successfully. But it does require a lot of work. But so at the moment there are some areas where there is a bit of a regionalised element. There is going to be a Scotland-specific shortage list. So shortage occupations means that it's a bit easier to get in within certain sectors or within certain occupations on those lists. Now, previously, we've not seen much use made of the Scottish shortage occupation list. It might be as we go forward and under this new system where there are going to be significantly more shortages, depending on the economic recovery. So, I mean, this all kind of depends on where labour demand ends at the end of this. So it might be that there is no labour demand, and so all of this will be moot for quite a long time. But if there is, then the question is, at the moment, the UK government's response is, if you've got shortages, raise your wages, and then you can employ people from overseas. Now, certain sectors, and the Scottish government says, well, in some sectors, that's just not doable. And under that, the sort of the high productivity aim that the UK government has set from migration, it's basically to say, well, those industries that can't raise their wages suffer from low productivity and essentially need to disappear. But at the moment, that includes hospitality, farming, food processing in Scotland. It feels very difficult to immediately say all of these sectors have low wages and therefore they're not highly productive and therefore they need to disappear from our economy. I think they are key parts of the Scottish economy. And even if we do need to, I think there's certainly arguments for more training, more investment, more capital investment, but you need to transition through that. Not cut off the mic. I think the idea that the problem with all of that has been that there's been too much migrant labor, I think that's probably wrong. I think that's too simplistic. But we may see, I mean, under the new system, it's so restrictive that if there is a lot of labor demand, we might find that we'll see more and more specialist visas. We've already got a health and social care worker visa announced.
Yes.
There might be more use of if youth mobility schemes are extended to the former EEA countries, then essentially you could do a lot of what was free movement under youth mobility schemes. But it's not so, I mean, it's a 2 year, so under youth mobility, this is for people aged 18 to 30. There's currently 8 countries within that. You can come over and work for up to 2 years. So that might be fine in terms of filling labor shortages, less fine in terms of addressing demographic issues, because actually then you want people to stay beyond the 2 years. So I think it really is something to watch where that ends up, but there are some worrying and concerning divergences and real reasons why they're there.
Yeah, I think that's right. Turning to and you've mentioned a number of examples of how divergence or at least accommodation could be given to particular Scottish or indeed rural concerns under this new model. What's the mood music? Is this all going to be kept in the Home Office and they'll be the ones that determine what comes down from the table at Westminster, or is there some acknowledgement that certain abilities should be given, or at least certain conversations could be had with the Scottish authorities in determining what is and isn't right for those regions?
I think it's difficult to say, and I wouldn't pretend to be party to
no, of course,
that level of insider knowledge. I think there has always been quite a lot of resistance to regionalising immigration policy in the UK. I think the ironic thing with an SNP government is that this gets wrapped up in a devolution powers type argument more than it needs to be. There could be a lot of things around this that are more about technical functions or than it is about, having a Scottish visa as such. I don't think you need a Scottish visa. What you need is routes into Scotland that work somehow, or mechanisms that allow you to tweak in certain ways. So I would certainly expect, if there was variation, to see more of in that region than in a powers region, perhaps. I don't know. And I think it's slightly ironic because I think it often gets wrapped up in that this is the same as any other regional government. I don't think you can regionally, I find it difficult to conceive of regional or local differentiation at a local government level, apart from maybe with some larger sort of cities with mayors and so on. I think you do need an infrastructure to do this. So it's at the devolved administrations like the Scottish Government and Welsh Assembly that this starts to look like a more possible thing. But that might not be the way the politics of it plays out.
Quite.
And who can say, to be honest?
Indeed. I think before we get a little bit more into the politics, I think that's a very interesting dimension as well, and one I do want to hear your thoughts on, which is an interesting question through from Stephen Curran, who I suppose would know very much about what the question he's asked, is can Scotland or Scottish local authorities ask for a larger share of asylum seekers to move here from other parts of the UK? Glasgow in particular, as I'm sure Stephen will know, has had a very positive experience of this in previous years, including in particular with young people. So is that something they're currently able to do? Is that something that we can perhaps encourage in the future?
It has been something that they're able to do and that they have been doing. Scottish local authorities have participated at a proportionately much higher rate than other local authorities in the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme. That's where you get refugees over from what was initially mainly Syria, but I think has expanded slightly more widely now.
Indeed.
So I think that that is something that can be done. I don't think it addresses your labour migration issue, though. I think in the end, asylum migration is about protection. And whereas labour migration is where you look into where you try to use migration as a resource amongst others for what you're trying to do economically and in other ways. And to some degree, you know, I think asylum seekers ought to work, particularly if the process takes much longer than it should. But reintegrating people who fled a war zone or have been through really big personal traumas into the workforce is not easy. Some do astonishingly well, but others don't. And so that's not a tool for addressing that problem. It's a tool for another problem, and I think there is scope to use some of that, but it's not the solution.
Indeed, and I'm not sure if this came across the question, but I don't believe that it is necessarily about redressing issues in the labour market, depopulation, etc. I think it's very much just the positive experience of having asylum seekers as a makeup of within the society. And
sure, and on that, I think Scotland has been very proactive, and a lot of that has gone well. Yes.
Yeah, is that something, and again, this is my ignorance, is that something that's been driven by the Scottish Government, or is that something that's really a groundswell from local authorities, local areas?
I wouldn't be able to comment. I'm not sure.
Sorry.
I do think it's coming from local authorities, but that's just...
Of course.
It's not something I work on. I tend to work on things outside protection, so I don't not privy to any particular knowledge of that.
No worries at all. Turning then back into the politics, so to speak, with a small p, don't worry. Scotland differs from the rest of the UK, if I can be so bold, in the sense that the majority of its elected representatives hold broadly positive views of migrants and immigration, broadly speaking, and indeed feel confident in professing those views very openly. Is this something that is reflected in the electorate? Do we have the elected representatives showing the electorate back to themselves, or are elected representatives somewhat different from the views of the public in Scotland?
So it actually doesn't map on to an electoral difference. Scottish views on migrants in terms of wanting immigration reduced are more or less the same as what you see in England. What it does, so it's a curious thing. Why is it there? You know, and they are broadly, you know, the largest category you'll get there is always that people want it reduced. So here you have political leaders going against the most popular opinion, and it's an interesting puzzle. But I think actually what is curious about it is, or the curious effect it has, where you do see a statistical difference, is that people in Scotland are more likely to acknowledge that immigration is good for Scotland than people in the UK are likely to acknowledge that immigration is good for the UK. So they may not want more immigration, but they do see that it is a good thing on balance. And I think there's a very interesting lesson in there about political leadership, because I think that's what, I mean, attitudinal data is always really difficult to interpret, and who knows what it relates to exactly and how to interpret it. But I think what you see there is political leadership on explaining to people, this is why we need this is why this is good. And that people accept that, you know, and migration, you know, brings pros and cons. But on balance, it's positive. and on balance, it's necessary. And I think that is actually what politicians ought to be doing in the environment that we've got, is to explain more of that to the electorate, because it does actually arrive in places. And I think what's very interesting in the UK is that while you always, and attitudinal data is very sensitive to how you phrase questions. So the attitudinal data, if you say should there be more or less immigration, people will say there should be less. But if you ask people, and this is UK wide, so there's a big Eurostat database on the people's views on past immigration. So was it a good thing? We poll one of the highest across the EU. Over 80%, yes, it's been positive. So it's very interesting that you have, we want something to end, but when we look back on it, it's positive in a way. One is an indicator of I think, migrant integration, and actually that migration has gone well. Mm-hmm. And the other one, I think, to my mind, is showing that, well, at the same time, migration is difficult, just in the same way as change is difficult. And that's, I think, what people object to, and it's a touchstone issue for a lot of other things. And I think Scottish politicians really should be commended for the kind of leadership they've shown on that, and that they have stuck to a constructive consensus on those issues.
Indeed. A comment, and I won't put this to you, Sarah, but I think just as a Glaswegian, I couldn't let it pass without noting. And again, apologies for anybody else who may want to disagree with this. A comment from Peter Taylor in the Q&A. That's extensive use of the asylum seeker dispersal scheme we were discussing a moment ago. Has come from Glasgow City Council, over 20 years under different administrations of different stripes. Other local authorities have largely failed to contribute. So responses on a postcard from anybody else from other cities who perhaps wants to disagree. But as a Glaswegian,
so the dispersal of asylum seekers to Glasgow is part of the Home Office dispersal programme, which I think was initially started in the late 90s. In which I think initially both Edinburgh and Glasgow were chosen as dispersal sites in Scotland, and then it became just Glasgow. And that is how it stayed until the Syria crisis in 2015, where the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme was set up again by central government, where local authorities can then bid to welcome refugees under that scheme. And I think now it's almost that a lot, if not all, local authorities in Scotland have got at least one family under that scheme. So you're right. I mean, that's just the history of it, is that a lot of this was focused on Glasgow. It's gone more widely, but that has been because Glasgow was a dispersal site for the Home Office.
And again, back to the politics, for which I apologise. We've got a comment in the questions from Ahmad Namazi, a good friend of mine who's an immigration lawyer, who asks, how do overseas nationals who migrate to Scotland tend to view the concept or proposal for Scottish independence? Is there any polling on that?
Off the top of my head, I just don't know. I think I have seen data on that, but I can't recall it.
Of course, yeah. And perhaps turning back to the subject of some of our discussions just immediately before this, how do you think immigration, broadly writ, would affect a second independence referendum if it was to be held?
It's a difficult one. I think in the last independence referendum, it was disputed how difficult it would be for Scotland to undertake its own immigration functions, border functions, citizenship, etc., and how that border with the rest of the UK would operate. And that was disputed to some extent, as one would expect, but it was actually also fairly easy to see solutions. I think one of the things that strikes me looking forward is how much more complicated that is after Brexit. Because before that, all the territories involved were inside a single legal kind of overarching territory of free movement. So of the EU, so free movement, kind of all of that kind of. So you sort of had a lot of things where you thought, well, actually, that looks just fine, and the common travel agreement. Whereas going forwards, I mean, the common travel agreement between the UK and the Republic of Ireland is set to outlive Brexit, and that will be quite instructive about how that's going to work. Because I think you can draw some analogies to the Scottish case, although I think the fact that it's a big land border, there are some big differences there as well. So you need to be a bit cautious about how you compare that. But I think the thing is, you know, with Ireland, the opt-in and opt-out of Schengen allowed you to be inside, or sort of in these little internested legal spaces. Unless Scotland can secure something along those lines, I find it quite difficult to envisage how it would work. Having said that, I think the CTA, it's got an almost 100-year history of being flexible, inventive. So who knows? And I do think, you know, that there are solutions to how you manage a border. It doesn't, you know, people often think of borders as this sort of, you know, of border guards and a border space that's physical. And actually most borders aren't. Borders are often about what you have to show that you're entitled to work, to employer, what you show you're entitled to work when you receive services. That's actually the border. It's just, you know, it pops up in certain places where you need to prove that you're eligible or entitled to something. So again, I mean, I you know, and I think, you know, both with the regional variation kind of arguments, but also in terms of what would that border look like in the event of Scottish independence. I think there's flexibility there that would be explored once that conversation got off the ground.
Yes, or indeed afterwards, if it's anything like the Brexit discussion. We've got about just over between 5 and 10 minutes left, unless we want to try and raise the ire of Adam, who's going to kick us off the stream. Okay. I'll invite any of the participants to ask any questions within the Q&A down the bottom of the screen if they want to do so. While they're thinking of that, perhaps I might just turn to what I think would be an interesting last question, and perhaps moving again away from the Scottish dimension into the UK sphere of things, and in particular of the Labour Party and in its kind of position on these kind of matters. After the general election last year, there's an undercurrent, or indeed an overcurrent, within Labour Party circles, calling for the party to appear more patriotic, to really emphasise its Britishness, or indeed its Englishness, or in order to win back seats in former heartlands. Is there a way that that you can envisage Labour doing this without resort to the difficult rhetoric around immigration that we witnessed during the last Labour government? A difficult question, I know, but I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think it's perfectly possible. In fact, I think it's essential to reclaim both Britishness and Englishness and any other type of ness on these isles from the idea that that's anti-immigrant. And I think that needs to be core. It's perfectly both possible and desirable to be patriotic and be pro-immigration, because immigration on balance has been of huge benefit to this country. I also think that I think what I would say on the patriotic thing is that the left cannot win when you tack to the right on migration. The right wins on migration. Even if you have more restrictive policies, people don't believe you on them. They believe the right. So all you do is you lend legitimacy and credibility to both the right, the far right, and the even further right if you do that. So essentially what you're doing is you're ceding ground, but you're not going to get any return for that. So so there's nowhere to win there for the left. I think what you need to do is understand the ways in which migration often acts as a touchstone issue, as a proxy for other types of discontent. So they're discontent about change, discontent about insecurity, discontent about housing. I think when people talk about migration as an issue, that's actually what they're talking about. And you need to have, we need to be addressing that. I think that's what's fueling it. And I think on that front, I mean, I think, for instance, I would highlight the experience of the actually center-right Bavarian CSU recently. The CSU have been trying to compete with the Alternative für Deutschland for, I'm not quite sure how long, but for a while, until they finally realized, in their terminology, that you can't outstink a skunk. And so they started tacking back the way, and not only are they now making some sensible policy choices, because I think this symbolic policy where you're trying to just communicate something, it's a disaster. I mean, we've just this month had we are spending 400 million pounds on the hostile environment, and our officials don't know what it's for, whether it works, how we might measure that it works, what harm is being prevented. We don't know anything. And so all we've done is we have legitimated that there's something to be hostile towards. And that is a huge problem. And I think that's a problem that whether it's Gordon Brown and British Jobs for British Workers, or Ed Miliband with the stone and the thing,
yes,
you lose when you make those arguments. You give the right legitimacy, and then you lose.
I couldn't disagree with a word of that.
Okay,
but you might very well think so.
That's fine. We sorted that then.
That's it. We've put the world to rights. I don't see any further. Oh no, wait, I do. There's another question in the Q&A from Ahmad again. Would a regional visa offer, and I think we'll end on this question because I think we've only got a few more moments, so we can perhaps keep the comments brief so I can give you proper and full thanks immediately afterwards. Would a regional visa offer that would necessarily include Scotland having some sense of devolved oversight in respect of Scotland realistically be overseen at a local authority level, or indeed a Scottish level, or indeed a Home Office level? Can you see that working?
Yes, I can. I'm trying to figure out the question. So whether England could have its own regional visa.
Pretty much.
I suppose if England wanted its own, I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is you need some kind of, you need the government infrastructure that can deal with this. So the problem is for England, I'm not quite sure where that would sit. Because there isn't an English Parliament as such. So you've got Westminster for that. So I'm not sure I entirely understand the question.
No, I think it's perhaps would this be a national decision-making body, or do you see these kind of decisions being properly made at a local authority level? And for my own view, I think local authorities are perhaps just slightly too fragmented to really offer any
think
great.
Local authorities. I find that difficult to envisage. I think it needs to be something slightly larger. A lot of this is really about what you would call kind of human capital selection that actually takes an awful lot of research, data gathering, data analysis to see whether something like that works. I'm not sure that I can see it in another way.
No, I think that's fine. Yeah. We've only got a few moments left, so at that point I'll say thank you very much, both to you, Sarah, for what has been honestly an absolutely fascinating discussion. And I'm sure all the attendees who are not able to communicate the same would say exactly that, both on this function and on Facebook and all the other various ways that we're fitting into people's living rooms. So thank you very much indeed. I don't know if you want to say, if anybody does want to follow your thinking as it goes forward, and particularly the development of your work as you formulate things towards the end of the year.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this with you. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope the audience have got something from it. And I would say, so for people who are on Twitter, I am on Twitter just as @Sarah Kyambi, and then you can see both the Twitter account for Migration Policy Scotland, as well as websites and so on. Migration Policy Scotland does have it's currently a project, and so there is a very small project website which is almost entirely ungoogleable, but you can put in www.migrationpolicyscotland.org.uk and you will find it. And I'm trying to keep people informed and involved of what we do as we go forward. So also please do reach out if you want to be kept informed, or if you've got ideas for what we should be looking at. We are currently developing a program. I'm really interested to hear what people think a migration-focused think tank for Scotland should be doing, and how we should be doing it, and with whom.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to keeping in touch with you, if I'm honest with you.
Great,
and,
that would be super.
Following your ventures going forward. Thanks everyone for joining. Right. A recording will be available if you do want to hear any of it back on the usual channels over the next few days, I understand. And yeah, if you've got any questions afterwards, you can contact ourselves at Scotland at youngfabians.co.uk. Thank you very much indeed.